Wake that ass up
Early in the morning.
The Breakfast Club.
Morning, everybody. It's DJ Envy, Angela Yee, Charlamagne the Guy. We are the Breakfast Club. We have a special guest in the building, and
That's right.
believe, Charlamagne, today is the start of Mental Health Awareness Month.
Yes, today is the first day of Mental Health Awareness Month. And she has put out a book today called The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. It is absolutely the best book I have read this year, period. Dr. Rheeda Walker is here.
Dr. Rheeda Walker, good morning.
Good morning, everybody.
Now, first, how are you quarantining? How is everybody with you? The family straight? Everybody good?
Yes, we're good. You know, got a little bit of cabin fever, as you might imagine. Got a child under the age of 10, so
Woo.
Yeah.
I got 3, so I know exactly what you're going through right now.
So how you keeping
how are you dealing with mental health?
Yeah, how you keeping everybody mentally healthy at a time like this?
How am I staying mentally healthy?
Yeah, the whole family, everybody.
Well, everybody has their way. So I'll probably just start with my son because video games. And I try and keep him off of video games, but that probably keeps him best connected to his friends. So I think it's been kind of normal for him because he gets more video games than usual. For me, I have spent time outside. So I have a small patio that when I'm starting to get into my head, I go sit outside, and that's most helpful for me.
Now, when you talk about the kids with video games, because I have a 5-year-old that's on this iPad all day, so I have to take it from him sometimes because he's into those video games, and I feel like his mind is so stuck on these games, he's not necessarily just seeing what else is going on with this world, so I kind of take it from him. So if you have younger kids, what do you suggest we do to make sure they stay mentally healthy?
Yeah, I think that we have to realize that this is a really difficult time, and not just for us, but certainly for our kids too. And so trying to find the balance. So maybe have an agreement. Okay, you can play for this amount of time, and then after that, take it off so that we can do something else. My son loves puzzles. So I have been trying to find as many puzzles as I can so that we can play puzzles and do, he likes Battleship. So we play games to keep him, to kind of distract him from the video games.
Gotcha.
Well, listen, let's talk about this masterpiece you wrote, The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. Like I said, best new book I read so far this year, and it's not even close. For those who haven't read it yet, what is The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health?
Well, I'll tell you, I was motivated to write the book because of the suicide rates going up for Black children that concern me. And I have been studying Black suicide since I was in grad school in the 90s. And my concern was that, 1, people didn't know, and 2, that we didn't recognize that we needed to turn into our own community to start to address some of the larger issues that I think have led to the suicide rates going up for Black children. So that's what the book is about, is how we first acknowledge some of the challenges that we experience as African Americans, some of those challenges, and then how on a day-to-day basis, we start to make change. I don't expect for change to happen overnight. These problems didn't arise overnight, but we need to start moving in a different direction.
Now, why do you think the suicide rate is shot up so much? You know, is it the music? Because I remember being a kid, you know, you wouldn't hear much about suicide. You know, now it seems like it's in the music, it's in the movies, it's on, you know, in the internet, and it seems like these kids are adapting. Not to say that it's a fad, but it almost seems like if things are not going well, it's an easier way to say, okay, I'm just going to take my life. And I see more and more kids adapting to that.
Yeah, I will say, so suicide is complicated. So there are a lot of factors that come together for a person to, 1, decide that they want to die, and then 2, to take the steps to take their own lives. But I think that one of the things that's happened for African Americans, because for a long time we didn't see suicide death rates, certainly for 5 to 11-year-old children. So that's where the rates were going up that really got my attention. So in our community, we've been through a lot. So going through having problems isn't new to us. So there's always been this sense of resolve that we can take care of whatever comes our way. I think we see this with Club Quarantine, like we create what we need to survive. But over time, there's been this sort of integration. I have students in my university classroom who say, you know, Dr. Walker, you talk about being Black and being African, but I'm just American. And so when we move away from this notion that we are a special African descendant people who have what we need in our community to survive, I think that when threats happen, because threats to our humanity will happen, and we don't have that sort of protection or covering of knowing who we are, then that's one of the reasons that I think theoretically we've seen the rates go up in our community.
Right.
Yeah, you talked about that in the book when you talked about why Wakanda Forever is so important.
Well, that was a force. The movie, The Black Panther, was something that we were so excited about, and I don't even think we understood what that movie, and it's a fictional movie, right? But we rallied around that movie because we saw so much positivity of who we were, and it was okay for us to be African and to dress up in African clothes. We had our salute, and it was special because we are special, but we've lost a lot of our connection. And I'll have folks say, I've never been to Africa. I don't know anything about Africa, but a lot of our culture is African in its origin, but we've lost that connection.
What are some things you say, because you said there are steps, right, as far as our children. So when it comes to nutrition, when it comes to education, what are some of the steps that you would tell parents if you're looking at your kids and you don't really know what to do to help them? You can see that they're going through something, maybe it's a depression, maybe it's anxiety, but you're not quite sure what it is. What are some of the steps you would advise?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And this is something that it works for children and it works for adults. It's communication. And it sounds simple, but I'm always fascinated by the degree to which we are hesitant for whatever reason. We fear if we ask the wrong question, we're going to upset someone. That maybe if we get an answer we don't want, we won't know how to help. But I think parents have to be willing, when they see something different, like you said, you see the child is looking depressed, ask them what's going on. I know in my generation, we didn't have a whole lot of talking about feelings. Like, that's just not what you do. But because we recognize there's a lot more vulnerability, we have to say, did something happen at school? Well, they're not at school. Homeschool is the situation right now. But what happened, say, on that video game? What's got you down? And maybe the child doesn't want to talk. We have to be willing to say, I can tell you're going through something. I'm here whenever you're ready to talk. And then be ready to talk and not be judgmental. So, saying, well, you should have been on that video game for 2 hours anyway. Like, that's not going to be helpful for someone who's going through something. Or, I told you should have left that job because those people didn't care about you. Like, we have to be willing to be physically present and suspend our judgments for people who are struggling.
How much is social media affecting kids now, would you think? Because I'm sure that has to be adding to some of the experiences that can be negative that kids are having.
Yeah, the research on social media is still emerging, but from what we can tell, it does seem that it feeds into that comparison, and I'm sure you all have seen it, where people are just compelled to compare themselves to others. Mm-hmm. Rather than recognizing, because we all have talents, we all have gifts, and we need to pay more attention to our own strengths and gifts. But instead, we're pulled in all of these different directions and trying to be someone that we're not. And so social media can facilitate that, unfortunately.
Now, the best thing that you said with this quarantine is, I hear about a lot of kids taking their lives, something going on and taking their lives and not being able to talk. I was talking to my 6-year-old the other day, and he was telling me that he did something wrong. And he was like, yeah, well, I just want to die because I did something wrong. And he was like, and I was like, well, why? And he was like, because I go to heaven and with God and everything is happy in heaven. And I'm like, he doesn't understand. He's getting parts of the stories. So then I had to explain to him, well, if you're not here anymore, you'll never see mom, you'll never see dad, you'll never see, and then he got it from there. But, it's just one of those conversations when they play these video games and they see a player die from getting shot and then they relapse and then they come back to life. That's what they honestly feel and they honestly think. So for a kid whose mind is pretty much, it's like a sponge, they're getting so much information. If you don't sit there and really see what they're doing and what they're going through, I can understand how this can happen. I say with the quarantine, it allows me to really be here with my kids 24/7, where I see everything. I see when they go to the bathroom. I see what they eat. I see what they're watching. I see everything, which I think is one of the best things about this quarantine with kids, especially.
Yeah, I see a lot of opportunity in quarantine. I know we have a lot of people who are hurt and a lot of people who've lost lives, and we have to figure out solutions for those families. And at the same time, we do have to dig in where we are. Like, what can I do? What can I learn about my child? You know, what can they learn about me? What can they learn about our family? And taking time that we probably have never taken before. So yes, I agree. There's a lot of, it presents, the world has slowed down such that we don't have any other reason to, or no other thing to do but to check in with one another.
Now we're talking to Dr. Rheeda. I'm sorry, we're talking to Dr. Rheeda Walker, the author of The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. And one of the first chapters of the book, you know, staying on the suicide topic, you say what you can do if death seems like the best end to pain. For those feeling suicidal, what can they do?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that we have internal resources and then we have external resources. And in the book, I also talk about psychological fortitude, right? So psychological fortitude is that the level of resilience or resistance we have to things that will otherwise challenge us or undermine our psychology. Like we need our minds in order to be in relationships, to work, to live our life purpose. But for some of us, like we're so worn down that we just can't function day to day. And so we have to tap into our internal resources. So for people who are feeling like my life doesn't matter, no one cares if I live, that if we can't tap into writing down our thoughts, because a lot of times we get in our head and we tell ourselves things that aren't helpful, like my life doesn't matter or I'm never going to be anything, which isn't true. Then we have to be willing to reach out to others. And that can be hard in our community, as you all know, because of this sense of strength and resilience that we have. That is important. But on the other side of that, we think, well, if I'm asking for help, then that means I'm weak. Well, I would challenge that. And that saying asking for help means that someone is strong enough to overcome their potential weakness. And those are some, you know, short-term things that we can do. So getting out of our head, try and write things down, changing our perspectives. I talked about that on one of my YouTube videos, that, you know, getting outside, because the challenges, and I don't know if I actually talked about this explicitly in the book, the challenge is that when people get into suicide-related crisis, it's hard to problem solve. It's hard to say, okay, let me figure out what to do now. They're so overwhelmed that they don't have the resources to figure out what the problem is and what the best long-term solution is. And so hopefully before they get to that point, they can reach out to someone, or family members and friends who've seen them struggling will reach out to them.
Yeah, now you mentioned, do you think a lot of suicide is I don't want to say accidental, but when I mean accidental is like, I think a lot of times, I think when people talk about suicide, a lot of it is for attention. They want people to care about them. And I think sometimes when people feel like, you know, oh, well, they said they were going to do it, they're not really going to do it. I think almost people like feel like they force themselves to be like, now they believe, they don't think I'm going to do it. And then they wind up doing it. Do you see that happen a lot?
I think, so that's tricky, because I do think that there's this conversation around like, oh, they just want attention. Mm-hmm. But the challenge of that is, what if something like what you described happens? And is it worth it to take that chance?
Right.
I want for folks to think of suicide crisis as a person in pain who wants the pain to end.
Right.
So however they go about getting that pain to end, they want it to stop. It is, you know, pervasive. It is in all of their thoughts. They don't see tomorrow, but they just want the pain to end. So maybe they have done something to put themselves in a risky situation, you know, not knowing how lethal it is, because yes, we have a lot of people who attempt suicide who don't die by suicide. Right. And then yes, there may be people who do things because they want to end the pain, not thinking that, say, taking a bottle of pills, like they're thinking, okay, this will at least, maybe it'll knock me out for a little while, but I'll be okay. But then it's really lethal, and so they die. So I think that it helps all of us. And I talk to my doctoral students about this because suicide is scary for everyone. And so when we think of, I have to keep someone from dying, it puts us in a tough place. But when we think of, this person's in a lot of pain, how can I reach out to that person to be helpful in their pain, even if it just means I go sit with them for a little while, or even if it means, you know, I go to club quarantine for a little while. Like, how do we help that person with their pain?
Gotcha.
You know, Dr. Rheeda Walker, you talk about reclaiming your mind. So how do you reclaim your mind and reclaim a life worth living?
Yeah, and I use reclaim intentionally because I do see African people around the world as having resilience within us, which is why we're still here. And so what I'm saying is, reclaim our connection to our African heritage and calling it what it is. And so I think I mentioned that, students will say, I don't know anything about Africa. I've never been there. There's nothing about me that is African. And it's just not true because we see it around us. And so when we reclaim, we have to learn more about our history, go to our African cultural museums, talk to our older relatives about what life was like when they were younger. What stories do they know? What kinds of things did they create? Like we have inventors in our family that maybe some of us are learning about because we're stuck at home. So we have to reconnect with what it means for us to be who we are and not criticize or be critical of things that are African and call ourselves, lazy in a way that a lot of mainstream folks have minimized or denigrated what it means for us to be who we are. So we have to have a positive sense of who we are as African descended people in different parts of the diaspora.
What advice do you give to people outside of this quarantine? Like, they're starting to open up things and people are losing jobs, they're losing money. There's going to be, I'm sure, a lot of people going into foreclosure, losing cars, losing things. How do you tell people to monitor their mental health in this situation? Is that even possible?
It is possible, and it starts with being intentional. So one of the things that people, humans, are inclined to do is to catastrophize things. Now, yes, losing a car and losing a job, it is hard. And so your emotional well-being, your psychological fortitude isn't about bad things happening. It is about managing your response or your reaction to that bad thing. So losing a job, for some people, and I know there are plenty of stories out there, that was a blessing that I lost that job because it allowed me to tap into my own inherent creativity, my business sense, to create something that was consistent with who I was. So I think the easiest thing is to focus on the next hour. When someone is overwhelmed, don't think about next week. Think about, okay, what do I need to do in the next 15 minutes? What do I need to do in the next hour? If what I need to do is just to kind of sit down and watch TV, then do that. Because otherwise we get so overwhelmed that it can be hard to figure out the solutions that are really in us or somewhere in our family or in our community.
Right.
What do you say to people who are having difficulties right now at home in their relationship? As we've been seeing, a lot of people have been realizing, maybe it's time for me to file for divorce. They're not sure how to work through whatever issues they have. Things are being magnified right now. What's your advice to somebody? Should they wait until this pandemic is over and then reassess? Or is this really a time when these might be some prevalent issues that you're like, okay, now I'm realizing what it really is now that we're in here 24/7?
Like you always said, domestic violence calls, you said, have shot through the roof.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and for those who are in domestic violence situations, there are hotlines and numbers to call to get support. This kind of goes back to those, internal and external resources, that in those kinds of situations, people can do the best that they can with what they know, but sometimes it works to reach out. And so I do say that because we know those rates are going up. As far as making other big decisions relationship-wise, I probably make the same advice that I do with anything that's hard, that at least take time to write down what are the pros and cons of the decision. Because with so many things, we walk around like, oh yeah, I know what to do, or maybe I don't know what to do. And we have these thoughts in our head that we can't quite sort through. I really believe in the art of writing. And sitting down and saying, okay, if I leave, this is the pros of leaving, these are the cons of leaving. And then if I stay, do the pros and cons also of staying. And that works with anything, staying in the job, keeping our children in schools where they're not reaffirmed. Like with any important decision, I recommend sitting down and writing down the pros and cons. And sometimes it's obvious, sometimes the pros and cons all equal. And then we have to decide just what makes the most sense just in my spirit, intuitively. What is it that I feel like I need to be doing? Because we have another gear in us. So we have our thoughts and our thinking and our intellect, but we also have, that voice. that's been pushing us in one direction or another that I think we all need to be paying a little bit more attention to, and that quarantine time gives us an opportunity to do.
Right.
That's right. Dr. Rheeda Walker, the author of The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. Now let's talk about Blackness, right? Because you have a chapter in the book, Racism is Bad for You, right? And you talk about the balancing act that goes along with having a Black identity, taking care of everyone else, and putting the effort into being put together despite being invisible. Expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, it's hard. I think for those of us who strongly identify, with being Black and recognizing that there are racial tensions in our society, there are consequences of being Black. A lot of us have been socialized, you gotta work twice as hard to get half as far. Like that over time puts a burden on us. And I do think it's one of the reasons that we see the high levels of hypertension and the high levels of health problems, in part because they've been passed on, so it's part of our families, but in part because on a day-to-day basis, we're struggling navigating how do I both fit in so that I can advance maybe at a job and get promoted, but also maintain my sanity and be true to who I am. And it's a juggling act. And meanwhile, there are folks who are being, taunted by the police and being killed. There was a recent video of a young person, who was, we don't know the story of what was happening, but these stories of time, we have the vicarious trauma. And so there's research that would show, even if we aren't being attacked by law enforcement, that when we see it repeatedly being looped on television and social media and wherever, that it has a psychological effect on us. And so all of these stressors come together. If we're not intentional, it really starts to get to us and wear us down.
So what's your definition of meaningful Blackness?
So I think there's levels. There's always levels. On the one hand, I think that we recognize that maybe how we dress, how we carry ourselves, and the foods that we eat, maybe. So that's a level of culture that I think a lot of folks resonate with. We know you don't put raisins in the potato salad and things of that nature. But on the other hand, there is, like I said, it's not random, as an example, that we're spiritual people. Like even folks who don't say go to a church or go to a place of worship believe in God. That's not random. Like that's a part of our cultural heritage that, yes, was passed down and that has allowed us to be as resilient as we are. So digging into who we are as a people, I really do believe that that is going to be the starting point for just a different kind of well-being, including psychological fortitude, including our businesses, entrepreneurship, like everything. That when we can connect to the fact that we were some of the original creators and engineers in society, in all of society, that we have to connect to that in order to be able to turn this boat around that's kind of sinking in a lot of ways.
Mm. Let's talk about a couple solutions. You said claiming your truth makes change possible. Why is that?
Yeah, I think there's, and maybe, kind of Angela was talking about, social media, that we are pulled in a lot of directions that aren't true to who we are. So we're trying to replicate being someone else when that person is good at who they are for a reason. And quarantine probably gives us some time to figure out who we are, to sit with our own thoughts. And when we can do that, it just gets us to a level of authenticity where we can be who it is that we were put here to be as individuals. When I was writing the book, and I will say, I didn't know I was going to be writing this book probably 3 years ago. I had no idea. But I did know that there were times when I had to go sit someplace quietly and hear my own thoughts. So Charlamagne, I have had to read my own book because I was like, oh, I said that? Oh, that's cool. I didn't know I said that, because these thoughts came from somewhere in me that I had to connect with, that I had to write down quickly, because if I didn't, they were gone. And we each have our own creativity, our own insight, our own spirit within us, that we have to connect with that rather than trying to replicate and duplicate what was created for someone else. Like,
Right.
it just doesn't work otherwise.
You're a doctor. Okay, go ahead.
And I was gonna say, we always talk about anxiety. How do you tell people to deal with anxiety? Especially if you have kids and everything that's going on in this world. Especially if there's things that you fear, whether I have a kid that's driving right now and she's a young Black woman and getting pulled over, or my son riding with his friends and, them getting into trouble, or even the other day, my daughter was jogging and she said a pickup truck pulled up next to us. So now every day I jog with her, not just me and her and the dog. We all go jogging. How do people deal with anxiety now? How do you tell people to deal with that?
Yeah, well, first we have to recognize where we are in our level of anxiety, because not everyone is the same, right? And so one of the things that I talk about in the book, I create a psychological fortitude meter. So on a 0 to 10, say 0 being really very low psychological fortitude and 10 being high, where are we? We can do the same thing with anxiety. So as an example, you mentioned the situation with your daughter in the truck while she's out driving. Sounds like your anxiety was probably at an 8 or a 9.
Right.
And so you did what you had to do to adjust. And now when she goes out, your anxiety is lower. So I use that just as an illustration. So we first have to realize, when I go into X situation, or when I'm in Y circumstance, how high is my anxiety? If it's at a 5 or higher, then we probably need to make some adjustments. At a 4 or lower, then we can probably sit with it for a little while. But what are the adjustments that we make? We evaluate. So what about this situation is in my control? In your example, what was in your control was, okay, I'll go out there with her. Maybe that's not an option for some people. They're in a situation that, they're high anxiety and they don't have any control. What is the part that we do have control over? And this is where we have to just sit and be mindful, maybe talk to someone else. Hey, this is the situation, it's got me up at night. A lot of folks now are having problems sleeping because of high anxiety. I was in a fog. It was probably an anxiety fog the first couple of weeks of coronavirus. And I was like, I can't get my work done. What's going on? I need to turn off the news. And once I turned off the news, then my anxiety went way down and I was actually able to get some stuff done. So we have to start with recognizing what the level of anxiety is. 2, if we can find the source of it, or if it's obvious, figure out how we can manage it, what's our control over it, and then see, did that work? If not, then we have to reassess and come up with another solution.
Now, when you say anxiety, is there really, because sometimes I try to figure out if I'm having anxiety or if I'm a caring parent, like every time my son goes out and I constantly think about, is he okay? Is that anxiety, or is that, I'm just an effing parent? And that's what you're supposed to feel. Like, it's hard to get to the difference between the two. Like when my kids go out, I'm effed up because I'm like, oh, they're right. But I'm a parent.
Yeah. There's a certain amount of anxiety.
Because I feel like anxiety should be good. Like you should have anxiety. If you really love your kids, you should be having those feelings. And if you're a parent and your kid goes out and you don't think about it, I just feel like you're not really a good parent,
I call that form of anxiety parental paranoia. That's what I call it.
It is. So the thing about, anxiety is a certain amount of, it's synonymous with worry. When your worry gets out of hand such that you can't function, that's problematic. But when your worry is adaptive, so we do things that are adaptive that help us to survive. And sometimes we do things that are maladaptive and don't help us to survive. So yes, if we worried about our children being out, whether they're jogging, playing in the street, out with friends or whatever, then our worry tells us, okay, we might need to do something. You got to call me, or I'm going out there with you, or you're not leaving the house at all. Like we do things to adapt to the worry. Some people do maladaptive things. They're worried about, say, bills. So they drink more. That's maladaptive, because drinking more isn't going to help solve the problem with the bills. So I do think that, yes, with parenting, there's a certain amount of inherent worry or just paranoia. And to be honest, for good reason. And I talk about this in the book that, Black people have to make different decisions because of, and it's not paranoia if it's real. Like if we know that we're higher risk for certain kinds of problems, then we have to manage that.
Now we talk about anxiety because we know anxiety is high right now, but what about stress? What are some tools to overcome and just straight up stress? People are just stressed right now.
Yes. Well, it's similar for just the anxiety. And stress is basically anything that we have to deal with. What happens is sometimes the stress gets so high that we feel paralyzed and overwhelmed. We start to do some of the maladaptive things. So we first have to recognize, okay, how high is my stress right now? Some people don't even have to ask. They know they're just so overwhelmed, they don't want to get out the bed. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we need to just stay in the bed. You know, I really hope that people don't just do what they feel like they should do. And Charlamagne, you know, I talk about should, like I drive my students nuts. I want should to be removed from the dictionary. But if we start with where we are, I've been in the bed maybe for a week. It's really time to get out the bed. What is it that I'm so overwhelmed by that I'm paralyzed? And start to have those dialogues with ourselves. It's okay to talk to ourselves. And start to write down, like I was saying earlier, like we can't just keep all of these thoughts bottled up in our heads. So write them down, call a friend. I saw, I think it was just yesterday with Yvonne, they did a video with, they just called their friends randomly and I loved it. So we don't have to schedule these calls. Sometimes we just pick up the phone and say to someone, this is what I'm going through right now.
Right.
What do you think?
Wow.
And just get out of our own heads. And the other part is I really do believe in getting outside, going for a walk, because shifting perspective, it really makes a difference.
Now, why do you hate the word should, Dr. Rheeda Walker? What's wrong with should?
So I really believe in meeting people where they are. And I want for everyone to just cut themselves some slack. We're going through an impossible time right now. Regardless of where we are, that's where we're supposed to be, unfortunately, for that moment in time. And so I know that people say should, it's kind of a motivator. Like, I shouldn't eat that whole bag of cookies. I should be able to manage my children who are driving me nuts right now. Well, it'd be nice if you could do those things, but if you want that bag of Oreos, then you might just need to eat the bag of Oreos for now. For now.
If I eat the bag of Oreos,
but then you're gonna regret it. Then you're gonna regret it later.
Let's come back to that. Let's come back to the regret. But I think that we have to cut ourselves some slack and say, okay, this is where I am. Would it be helpful if I did not eat that bag of Oreos because I'm going to regret it later? Yes, that would be helpful. But if there is something in us that's saying, I need to do this right now in order to get to 5 minutes from now, I'm with you. And then once we're 5 minutes from now, then maybe we can check in. But the word should creates anxiety. Because if we're saying as a parent, you know, because I know there are a lot of parents, I've gotten a lot of those questions from, you know, just in the community. If we're a parent and we're having a tough time with homeschooling, I'm homeschooling, it's not fun. And we say, I should be able to do this. My child is in 3rd grade. Well, if you're not able to do the work, then there is a reason. And we say things to ourselves like should, it just makes us feel bad. It makes us feel worse. So
although there is
should pressure.
There's something to be said for willpower, because I might be like, I should go get on that treadmill. And I know I should. And that's how I actually can convince myself to do it. I do like little tricks. Like once I put on my exercise clothes, I know I have to do something. And I might tell myself, because my parents dropped off all this junk food, and I'll say, okay, you know what? I can eat 1 cookie, but I can't eat 2. And I do that to myself, you know, all the time, because I know if I do that, I'm like, it takes a half an hour for my stomach to tell my brain that I'm full. So let me eat this, and then I'm gonna wait a half an hour, and then I'll be glad that I didn't eat 2. And I do those things to myself all the time. So I do, I guess, use the word should and should not.
Well, but it's not, you're advanced. when you can say, you know, it's going to take an hour, it's going to take some time for my stomach to know and my brain to connect.
I do tell myself things like that all the time.
Yeah, that's too much when they got
I'm like my own accountability partner. I talk to myself and I'm like, okay, Angela, if you know you're about to get your period, I know that's why you're really hungry right now. So instead of having this, let's make yourself a smoothie and then let's wait an hour and then see how you feel after that. I always do that to myself.
Right. And I love it. Why? Because it works. We each got to, like, wherever we are, we have to do what works. Not everyone can do that. Like, you might have a conversation with a friend and they say, and you're trying to convince them of your approach. And they're just like, no, just no, they're not here for it. And so you can just talk to them about what you do. They can't do it today. If they tell themselves, I should be able to do what Angela does, that's going to make them feel worse. So every individual has to start where they are, because maybe 15 years ago, you couldn't do that and you would have just enjoyed all the junk food.
You know what? I'm a spiritual person, right? So now that I think about it, it's kind of like should is getting in the way of God. And what I mean by that is when the universe tells me to do something, when God tells me to do something, there's nothing that needs to happen except for me to do it. But as soon as I say should, I start questioning what the spirit just told me to do. And then you question it yourself, then you might ask somebody else, and then the doubt comes in, and the anxiety comes in, and the indecisiveness. So I feel like should gets in the way of God.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but I can definitely see it. Because should has layers to it, right? So should can come from society, you know, should can come from our families. Should is usually something that is external to us, that we're trying to meet some demand. Whereas, you know, our internal voice that is, I do believe, is connected to our higher power, you know, that internal God voice, it's just more natural. And people are more inclined to do what's natural than to do what they should do.
You know, in the book, you know, speaking of voices, like you talking like just a very relatable language. Like what made you approach the writing of the Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health in that way as opposed to being like clinical?
Yeah, well, I think maybe there's some clinical in there, but
definitely.
I'll tell you, the publisher said to me, okay, so the first round of draft, they read and they said, okay, that's nice. And they said, but it's too academic. I've been a university professor for 17 years, writing scientific papers. That's what I do most naturally. So that's what I did. And so they said, well, can you write it like you're talking to a friend? And I said, okay, are you sure? Because the way that I talk to my friends are very different than my academic voice. And so once they said that they were sure that that's what they wanted me to do, then that's what I did. And that's part of how the title of Unapologetic came about, because we just have different kinds of conversations in the community than we do, I think, outside of the community. And I didn't want to have to apologize for that.
Now, you must have a Black publisher for them to understand that. Really? Well, that was great advice they gave you, because it really does connect in a real way, and I think it's gonna make people, you know, really embrace that journey that they need to go on in order to get mentally healthy.
Yeah, I have to give them credit. Ryan Baresh was the acquisitions editor, who the first time that I talked to him, the hairs on my arm were standing, because he so believed in the project that I was proposing. Like, he believed in it probably more than I did. Like I said, I started out just wanting to bring attention to, we got to help our children. Like, that was my initial goal. But I did connect that problem of what was going on with our children with our larger community. And so I did have the sense of, okay, we got to fix things in our community in order to fix this problem. But he saw it as something bigger. And I think that's part of the reason that they were inspired to say, you know what, we're just going to let you do you. And I said, okay. And we went with it.
No, I agree with Ryan, man. I think this book is amazing. I think it's a game changer. I think it should be in, you know, not just every Black household, but every household, period, because it really, 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 really is an amazing book that can help you learn and navigate this these uncharted murky waters called Black mental health.
Yes, well, Doctor, we appreciate you for checking in. Thank you so much.
Oh, and last question. Today's the first day of Mental Health Awareness Month. What would you like to see people do during this whole month of May besides reading your book?
Not what should they do, but what would you like?
Love it, love it. So yes, definitely remove the word should from our vocabulary. No, actually that's not right. That's not what I say to my students. What I say is to notice it, because change happens over time. And so I wouldn't expect for anyone hearing this for the first time to remove should from their vocabulary. It's probably not going to work. They'll start saying, well, I ought to. What we can do is to notice how often we should. So I'll say that, but I say more about it in the book. But I think that during this time, you know, that we don't have, that we are self-contained on so many different levels, that we take the opportunity to really find quiet time. Maybe it's go into the bathroom for 10 minutes and close the door, go into a closet, go sit outside, take some paper and a pen. We don't even have to write complete thoughts. Just write words, like whatever comes to mind. Just start writing so that we can start to be more introspective about what this time means for us individually. So we can talk about our family and we can talk about other people, but we need to really connect with our own inner voice so that we can figure out what the long-term game plan is. Because we all have short-term and long-term, and we need to figure out what that is for our first selves individually, but then also thinking about our community collectively. Because each individual exists in African community, each individual exists because of the community. So we start with the individual, and then we think about how we can be a resource for our larger community.
Well, thank you so much for checking in and joining us.
The
Thank you, Dr.
Unapologetic Guide to
Walk.
Black Mental Health. You see me holding it up, you gotta go order this. Everybody go out there and order this book right now. It's on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, wherever you buy books. The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health by Dr. Rheeda Walker. It is a game changer. My favorite book that I read this year. Dr. Rheeda, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all.
All right, it's the Breakfast Club. Good morning. Thank you so much.